Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's session of Compliance Conversations. I am so excited for today's conversation, and my guest today is a regulatory affairs expert. He's been in the field for a very long time and has gladly agreed to join us today and share his experience. I'm talking, of course, about Boitumelo Kiepile, and we're going to be discussing the world of regulatory affairs today. He has a BCom honors degree. He has over 10 years experience in the field of regulatory affairs and policy matters. He's worked at National Treasury, ICASA, NERSA, and is currently the head of regulatory affairs at a renewable energy organization, a global organization. And of course, has also served on several boards. So when I say we have a regulatory affairs expert on board, I know that, and that's, just a high level summary of his career, then you can truly understand why I'm excited about today's conversation. So welcome to Compliance Conversations, Tumi.
Thank you, Kutai, and thank you for hosting me. And I'm looking forward to the conversation this afternoon.
I'm so glad. And the important thing and why I wanted us to have this conversation is that at one time in my life, I was a regulatory affairs manager. And it's not something, and as interesting as I found the field, it's not something that I hear a lot of people talking about when we discuss career options, in our profession in the regulatory legal space. So I really wanted to shine a light on it and just let people know what it's all about and how I think, and I'm sure your experience also, which is extensive, that is such a great career path that people should really be looking into. So I'm just going to jump right into the conversation and get started. So I mentioned that you went to the University of Pretoria and you have a BCom in economics, right? But now you're the head of regulatory affairs. And how did you enter into that career path, starting from a background in economics?
Thank you for that question. And I think from an introductory perspective, having been studied economics. I mean, economics teaches you about market structure, how economic agents such as households, firms, governments interact. And from a market structure perspective, then you get to learn, you know, in economics, we start with economic theory to say, there's perfect markets, but we know that markets are not perfect. Then you get the market structure where there's monopoly, where you've got one entity supplying a good or a service, and the behavior of monopoly companies can be erratic. They can decide to restrict, the supply of the good, which would push up prices. So in that manner, you get then government saying, well, let's intervene in this market, to correct for what economists call market failures. These could relate to environmental externalities, but they could also relate, as I said, to an observed monopoly structure that then has social impacts moreover than the economic or price impacts. So how government then intervene is by way of putting laws. And I mean, laws have existed, from years immemorial, So you had feudal system where people were required to pay tax to the feudal lords, and the laws kept on coming and coming, and governments looked at this and said, well, you have this market structure that doesn't, result in socially optimal outcomes, especially now where we define regulation to be done in the public interest. So what is the public interest here would be to give people lower prices or affordable prices, not necessarily lower, because the company also, the firm is also a member of the public, and the firm
True.
makes money. So it developed in that nature, and then governments then would come in either directly or via an independent regulatory authority, as we know them. We've mentioned the likes of ICASA, which is the Communications Authority of South Africa, the National Energy Regulator on the energy side. You have the Reserve Bank on the financial side or on the banking side. And I mean, you have the Financial Sector Conduct Authority also, in the space of finance and financial services. So these agencies actually come in and put in, well, firstly, these agencies are creatures of law. They are
Yeah.
put there by statute. So then they must execute those laws in terms of how they control market access, how they control end users, how they deal with you know, the provision of the service in question in terms of whether it is affordable or whether it is in the right quantities and also in the right quality. So this is where from economics you get to understand the reasons why regulation is required, but moreover you get to understand what kind of regulation is needed for a particular outcome within a particular market structure. So for me to get into this space was pretty seamless because of my background as an economist in terms of understanding market structure and by extension understanding the typical market structure, say, of a of the telecoms industry. If by way of example, cell phones were introduced in South Africa when in 1994, 1995, around 93, 94, around there. And you had only two entities, mobile telephone companies, which was MTN and Vodacom. And, this was something new. It was not known in the country, even from the regulatory perspective. You know, these guys sort of were driving the regulatory agenda because they knew their business more than the regulator. So it took some time for the regulator to get to a point where it says, well, in actually fact, from a policy standpoint, government said we need a third operator, which is when Cell C came into being.
Yeah.
But by the time Cell C came into being, the market power or the market dominance of the two incumbents was so entrenched that it became difficult for Cell C to gain ground. What did government do? It said, well, you need to lower the wholesale price, which is called in the terminology of mobile telecommunication, is called the termination rate. So this is the rate that the mobile companies pay to each other to initiate a call from one network and terminate it into the other network. But now you understand that because Cell C had less customers, so there were more calls originating from Cell C, terminating either on a Vodacom or on a MTN network. So if that fee is high, then you are going to get an outflow of money from Cell C going into the two incumbents. So government intervened to say, lower this tariff so that you can give the third, mobile operator space to try and operate.
Yeah.
So, by way of introduction, I thought just to set the scene in terms of where is this area coming from,
Yeah.
and we will get into the other aspects, especially when we get to the misconceptions where
Yeah.
people ask, we're an economist, but we are talking laws, we are talking regulations, we are talking tax, we are talking rules. How did this come about? But it's this kind of background. And just to conclude on this introduction is to say that this background allowed me also to navigate the different industries, and again, we will touch on this in terms of what people can look to in order to get into the career of regulatory affairs, which somehow does link to compliance because
Yeah.
regulations are there to tell you how to do stuff and you need to comply. And if you don't comply, then you get penalties. Most legislation would impose penalties, for non-compliance.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important how organizations have regulatory affairs teams or managers or leads, whatever it's called in a particular space, to have that interaction between business and the regulators to ensure that business has that voice, to be able to give that feedback, like you're referring to, in terms of, you know what, this is not working in the market. These are the policy that changes that need to take place. So that whole regulatory affairs facilitates that conversation. So it's just very interesting to see also how your background in economics enhances the understanding of, you know, the mechanisms behind that, and is not purely just, you know, at a regulatory interpretation kind of level. It looks at it more holistically. So, you know, I'm very excited to delve deeper into that. And you touched on my next questions in terms of some of the misconceptions that people have around, excuse me, regulatory affairs. What would you say some of those are, in terms of their understanding or appreciation for the work that happens?
I think first and foremost, as I said, it's not really a legal profession, and although you do have to have the skill of understanding the laws. And I mean, you pointed out that not only from an interpretative, perspective, we've got legal people who will interpret the law in terms of if it says, the authority may or the authority must, which then is the distinction between something being obligatory or something being, discretionary. So you do have to have the understanding of the laws, but it's not a legal profession. And I think it's not about governance. Governance has got to do with, how decisions are made in a company. You follow a certain process, which then can get even audited, and outcomes then will determine whether the decision making in the company, whether the person who made that decision had the authority to make that decision. Most companies have delegation of authority matrices, at which certain decisions, sometimes they are linked to how much the money involved is, then that decision can be made there. That's not the role of the regulatory manager. And I think another misconception is that people look to regulatory affairs to solve legal challenges or legal problems. And by the time there is a finding maybe of non-compliance, it's too late for the Regulatory Affairs Division or department to get involved. You now need a team of lawyers to come and argue with whatever authority is trying to impose a fine, to say, well, no, the legislation said give me 10 days to respond, but you're coming on the eighth day and you say I'm late and all of those things, or whether it's business day or working day or calendar day. you know, from a regulatory perspective, it's late for us to get involved. However, to counter this kind of misconception, I always say that, the regulatory manager, him or her needs to be involved from the start. Him or her needs to be part of the strategic team or the strategic processes. You talk pharmaceutical, you, this person must be involved from when this particular medicine or drug is being developed, from conception, from the ideas, start, so that the person is able to chart a way to say these are the applicable laws, these are the applicable regulations or standards or rules, if they've got to do with quality, labeling, and also to undertake, a risk assessment
Yeah.
to say, well, if we take this route, these are the kinds of risks that we must look for. Or if the law can change whilst we are still even in this development phase of our drug, which potentially is likely to give us this type of revenues. But let's look out for this, and the regulatory affairs manager then is responsible for coming up with mitigation measures in terms of how do we navigate this process up until we get to a point where we've got an approved product, and then the product can be launched to the market. And I mean, this also creates this conflict between the regulatory affairs division and the business and the marketing guys, because whilst whilst you've got this guy who says, hey, look at this, look at that, potential for risks, potential for, you want to register a product, a pharmaceutical product, but now there's over regulation in the sense that the authority comes back to the company and says, you need now to comply with 3, 4 extra, requirements. How do we then navigate that from a business process perspective? Now we
Yeah.
thought only these requirements are applicable to us, but now there's more. So this is the job that I always say it's the ex ante activities that are involved in regulatory affairs, in shaping the strategy, in ensuring that by the time the development or conceptualization of a product is done and we are ready to go to market, we've covered all our grounds.
Yeah, and this is like something that is actually very dear to my heart in many ways from my own experience is that, people sometimes, or they say that conflict that you referred to between business and regulatory affairs and compliance when we're talking about product development, business development, is that whole, there's almost a reluctance to bring things early because of some of the challenges that might face. But it's almost, cutting your nose off to spite your face sometimes, because if you bring it to the table late or bring it to regulatory affairs late, and then, like you're saying, the regulator comes back and says, actually, we need you to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra things, it then pushes back the timelines in terms of your launch date. It pushes back the timelines in terms of, the product development if changes need to be made. So I think there really needs to be a concerted effort in terms of everybody coming to the table and understanding that it's in their best interests to engage compliance and regulatory affairs from the get-go, like you mentioned, to make sure that that process is much more seamless and that the lead time, incorporates any particular delays that may come from the regulator. So, I think that's a very valid point. Sometimes, like you're saying, misconception is that compliance is just, or regulatory affairs is just going to put the brakes on everything. We're going to come to them at the last minute when they don't have a choice but to run around and make it happen. But unfortunately, that ends up, putting us in a difficult position a lot of the times when things then have to be slowed down rather than just, forced through the pipes. So I think that's a very valid point. And I think I mentioned earlier on that, you've worked in financial services, you've worked in telecoms, and now you're in the energy sector. How did you navigate between these different industries? And I know you also alluded to, regulatory affairs, let's say within the pharmaceutical space, which I know, looks a little bit different from what regulatory affairs looks like in financial services. How was your ability to navigate between different industries? How did you manage to achieve that?
Yeah, and I mean, firstly, here, I would say maybe fortunately for me, in the industries that I've worked in, most of them are what is classified as network industries. We're talking telecommunications, we're talking
Mm,
electricity, we're talking other energy sectors here. And as I said, the common denominator is that there were network industries, and having understood just from a theoretical basis how network industries work from an economic point of view, it
mm,
was quite seamless for me to move from one to another. And I think luckily also the movement also, when I moved, say, from ICASA, where I handled mobile telecommunication regulations, I also handled tariffs, pricing. The fundamentals or the basis of all of this is economics, and the thread is cutting. Then the some idiosyncratic elements of them, where one, the network works differently from the other, or where the market structure, when you look at mobile telecommunications, as I explained, you had two operators, there was one added, but now you look at electricity, especially in the case of South Africa, you have ESCOM. which is a vertically integrated entity that does generation, transmission, and distribution. So I think it is the approach then that changes, but fundamentals in terms of what kind of regulation we're going to put into place. Is it price regulation? Is it revenue regulation? And what kind of techniques you'll have to bring in here? You know, there's talk of rate of return regulation. There's talk of benchmarking. So those are used in different industries by the regulatory authority to ensure these outcomes, these social optimal outcomes that I spoke about. And I mean, you mentioned that it's quite different from pharmaceuticals. I haven't worked in pharmaceuticals, but I just know it, from interest sake, and I mean, it's not a network industry, but let's think about a new drug for treating cancer, which I mean, I read one article that said some drug in the US actually would cost something in the region of more than 200,000 US dollars per annum just to get that drug in 4 injections for the year. So, then the regulator needs to sit and say, well, what are the public interest, you know, areas that impact on this drug or on this company, and how then can the government come in with a form of regulation that will ensure that people who are, suffering from cancer can get access to this drug. And I mean, this also puts the government in a precarious position in a way that there is a cost then, there's a cost to the regulation, but there could be a cost of saying, well, do we then as government bring in a subsidy, to ensure that this drug is available to everyone that needs it? But it also raises issues of saying now, well, what if then we introduce a new entry to this market who will be able to manufacture a similar kind of drug but at a lower cost, which then ultimately means the price of the drug would be cheaper. This is where or maybe the same company can be in a program that will manufacture a different variant of the drug. This is where the space of generics. This is where they come. So, government has got various levers from a policy stance and also from a regulatory stance to say, can we facilitate entry into this market? If we talk banking in the South African case, you had this unwritten policy previously that there can only be big banks in South Africa. I'm not going to brands. I'm not going. And, you know,
We all know who they are.
and, and the structure then carried on like that for a longest time. And I mean, this is for me is like 15, more than 15 years ago when I was at the National Treasury, and I seem to remember that one of the entry barriers, which is a form of market failure, was that to get a banking license, you needed in excess of 2 billion rands just for the capital outlay. And by capital outlay, I'm not even talking about money to get the buildings or the machinery, just money that is held and by the Reserve Bank under the the Banks Act. It's called a
Yeah.
capital requirement. Just that money that will sit there and do nothing, so that able to take deposits, and should anything happen to those deposits, then that money can be used to pay your
Yeah.
deposit holders.
And I don't know
So
about you, but I don't have 2 billion rand sitting around that can, at all, let alone that can be doing nothing.
yeah, I introduce this as an example to then
Yeah.
go to the levers that government then has, where then the South African government took the decision to say, well, you know, to enable more access, more choice, more affordability, you know, more access to financial services. We needed more banks, and we needed to sort of get into a system of tiered banking. So you've got the tier one, which would be your big banks. Then you've got tier two, which will be banks that will offer, a suite of services, not the full bouquet, but the services that are necessary to get a Dumi or a Kuzai to be able to have access to the banking services. And
Yeah.
then the requirement to get that kind of a banking license would be lower. So this is the lever of controlling access, to the market and making sure
Yeah.
that the entry barriers do not prohibit these socio optimal outcomes that is sought by regulation.
Yeah, for sure. Because at the end of the day, regulators are there to protect the different markets that they're operating to, and make sure that they grow and the policies are suitable for what is required at that particular place and time. And I was just thinking about the example you were giving about the pharmaceutical companies earlier, and it took me back to the previous question where about when we're discussing the misconceptions, and it reminded me of an example of when it goes bad. So I read an article about, and it made me wonder, where were the regulatory affairs people? It was a pharmaceutical company. And a product was released into the, not where were they, but why weren't they engaged in the process by the company? But a product was released into the market. It turned out to have significant side effects, and then had to be recall, loss of profits, I think into the billions of dollars. And again, I won't mention names for obvious reasons. And it just goes to show the impact of when you don't engage your team, your regulatory affairs team in the process and make sure that everything is ticked. Because although it can be, quicker to just, march ahead, the regulators put policies in place for a reason. And that's just to illustrate, like you're saying, there's tariffs and benchmarking and that's put in place that protects the consumers and makes sure that they're not, exploited or overpriced in terms of what the services that they're getting. And again, in industries like pharmaceuticals, it makes sure that we're getting products that are safe and suitable and don't have negative complications and implications for people. So it just, something you said just triggered those memories in terms of just highlighting that it's not just about tick box exercising. There are real life consequences when regulations are flouted, and or maybe it's a mistake, maybe not necessarily intentional, but if something is overlooked and not done properly, then these kind of things can result. So that's another point I just wanted to highlight in terms of the importance of regulatory affairs engagement across these different industries. And then just speaking about the industries that you've been in, and I think there's a lot of regulatory NERSA, ICASA experience in your background, and now you're sort of in a different space in the renewable energy and in a private sort of capacity. I know this is a bit of a curveball, but I hope you don't mind. It just came to me. What has that difference been for you in terms of looking at things from the regulatory perspective? Like you're saying, what are the policies that need to be put in place? And now that you're kind of on the other side of the fence, and it's like, okay, now I'm almost lobbying for the other side of the team. How has that been sort of a different experience for you? Between the two.
I, I mean, I would say it has been a very good experience. And in somewhere in my notes here, I've actually written that I'm very glad I started my career from a government and regulatory agencies perspective, because what that does is that before you can regulate, you need to understand the industry that you are going to regulate. You need to understand the market structure. You need to understand, you need to put yourself into the business operations of that regulated entity. Then you'll be able to come back and sit and make or craft regulations that are necessary, that are proportionate, that do not create over regulation, and that sort of, we spoke about regulation being in the public interest, and that we're seeking these socially optimal outcomes. So you cannot, I think for me, the benefit of having learned from government and having learned from regulatory agencies made my career easy, and it made it more seamless to then move and be on the other side. And I mean, being now on the other side, the benefit actually is that I understand regulatory processes. You know, I can interrogate them in terms of before they can even be put into place, in terms of how are they going to impact on the business operations of the company. And that then allows me to have, a sort of glancing eye to say, if we are going to develop this kind of a project, this is the areas, 4 or 5 areas to look at.
Yeah.
And in that way, I'm able to formulate a strategy that is solid, because then I get into my sometimes currently where I work, they always sometimes say, why are you behaving like you are the regulator when you are but that's the essence of everything, as we've been saying, that if if then the company seeks to do business by flouting regulations, by flouting standards, by flouting rules, not only in different industries the impact could be different. We talk of pharmaceutical, that a drug can have side effects, but I mean, let's look. I mean, regulation is not only about the money things. I'm in a highly technical space, which is electricity now. So if we do things in a manner that flouts some of the technical standards, can you imagine the impact it will have on our own staff members who need to work in those environments of high voltage, say electrical, and there could be dangers that they're exposed to. So, from I always say the regulatory affairs manager is actually the guardian of the company, because then you need to identify all these risks, whether they be of a technical nature, whether they be of a compliance to a regulation that can result in monetary losses. So all of those things, when they come together then to protect the company, for a lack of a better way,
Yeah.
But the experience that I got from working in government, in when I do my mentoring stuff, I tell people it's better to start at government, because you get exposed to too many to a wide area that you are working in.
Yeah.
At National Treasury, I worked for a division called Financial Sector Policy, and my subdivision was dealing with banking. But I got exposed to regulations or policies relating to pension fund, and how pension funds work. And you'd understand that I also was a part of a pension fund scheme even today. So you needed to know, when they say, there's prescribed assets, such as the ones that now are enforced under Regulation 28 of the pension funds, prescribing certain assets for companies not to go and do willy-nilly with our money.
Just
You know,
invest as they please.
So, and talk about experience at ICASA. I was in tariff department relating to broadcasting, but I was part of a committee that actually drafted the license fees for broadcasting companies. So you get this exposure that in the whole then becomes this one kind of a Bible that, well, it exists in my head, it can never be taken. But it's beneficial when you are
Yeah.
going to enter into different industries.
No, absolutely. And I think that the thing with, and I noticed a trend even in the years that I was still in corporate, that, you would get these announcements of, a former person who was in the regulatory space now being appointed in the private space. And I could see the advantages of that for, the private company, the bank or whatever, because you have this person who has the insights of what is going on, what are the regulatory priorities. And it's not just someone, or such as myself, sitting at a desk trying to figure out what is it that they're interested, what are they looking at. It's someone who actually has direct in the regulator experience, that they can then bring to the organization and, focus them in terms of, this is what their priorities are, this is what we should be avoiding, this is what's going on. And again, because you also have your connections, right? Just because you left the job doesn't mean you don't have that network anymore. So, you can always reach out to someone much more easily and be like, listen, I'm having this challenge, or I'm not quite understanding what this is about. Let's have a conversation and take me through it. Those sort of nuances and navigating becomes a little bit easier when you have that background. And just to your point also about, the fact that and why I'm so fascinated by the fact that you've had this experience across so many different industries, is that it just goes to show how multifaceted a career path this is. You're never going to be locked into, this is what you wake up and do and finish it, and tomorrow you wake up and do, you can have access to so many, even within financial services regulation. Like you said, there's pension funds, there's all sorts of collective investment schemes, banking, and all that sort of stuff. And then you move on to energy and telecommunications. So as within the regulatory affairs, you can literally have 16 different careers in the lifespan of your career. And, it gives you that versatility.
And just to add on that, because let's now just put a spotlight on energy. You know, I mean, energy is it's a minefield. And I'm using this word minefield, deliberately, because I want to mention that mining on its own, some of the mining sectors or industries are part of the energy value chain. Like coal.
Mm,
So, you know, from a regulatory affairs perspective, it's a specialization to be a regulatory affairs manager in just a coal mining company, or
mm,
in a petroleum company, or in an electricity generation company, be it renewables or any other kind. So as you're saying, it's a career that has so many tentacles, and it requires then one to be able to, yes, have this bird's eye view, but also to hone in and get a particular skill that you can be
mm.
specializing in. So there's so much to do. And as you said, in one industry, you have multiple things. In financial services, you have pensions, you have banking, you have collective investment, you've got so many things that you can build your career upon, but also be able to apply them either in the same sector, different industry, or across the sectors and across the industries.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting, and I know I said this at the beginning of the conversation, and I think when we've talked previously that, sometimes I feel like there's certain specialities maybe in the compliance and regulation kind of world that get a lot of focus, and everyone is studying to do AML, and everyone is right now, it's all about data privacy. And one of the core reasons that these type of conversations are important is that it opens people's eyes to exactly what you've just said. That, just imagine having a specialization like regulatory affairs. You could literally spend your life just doing regulatory affairs in financial services and still have a very multifaceted experience. Or you could, like yourself, have different industry experiences and also have a multifaceted experience. So it's just great that, we can shine a light on it, and people can get to truly appreciate, through your sharing today, that, regulatory affairs is that it's not only, I mean, compliance and regulatory affairs, people shouldn't only think about, those things that are topical all the time. There's something else that can be, very satisfying and fulfilling career. But in light of your career and your experience, I'd like to know, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned across the board, from your first day in the office one day to where you are now. Can you share some of the lessons that you've learned in your career?
I think, firstly for me, it's the dynamism, and and the ability to be dynamic, and the ability to adapt. I mean, we're speaking different industries, and I needed to get to adapt, and that adaptation also became, very glaring when now you are in the other side. And another thing here with adaptation was when I then started a consulting firm, which now sought to assist, and on both spectrum, to assist the regulators, and on the other side to assist the regulated entities. So you sort of juggling these two, and in one aspect you are telling this guy to say, look, this is how you can navigate here. These are the critical parts. The other side, you are telling the other guy, you know what, just tighten the screws. These industries are
You were playing both sides of the fence.
but another biggest lesson for me was being open to learning. As I said, I've worked in very highly technical industries, and you need to open yourself up to learning. You need to be able to understand, not really to be, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an electrical engineer.
Yeah.
If I was in pharmaceutical, I would not be a pharmacist. But you need to get to grips with, the terminology, the jargon that is being used, and the processes, of how electricity, by the time you switch on the light in your house, you need to have an idea that, well, let's talk South Africa, it came from a coal mine, it was coal, it had to be grinded into powder, it had to go into a boiler, and this is the process that happens inside the turbine up until you have electricity in your house. And the different components that are involved here, whether it's transmission or distribution. So for me, being open to learning was the biggest lesson, and I still embrace it even today. And as I said earlier, I'm pretty much grateful that I've started my career in government and regulated, authorities, because that then opened up my mind to say, you know, don't look at what you are doing now, but look at the entire bigger picture. As much as I was at NERSA also within the electricity and pricing tariffs department, they created a space that saw some of us getting to committees that were dealing with piped gas as one of the industries that is regulated by NERSA, and petroleum pipelines. So you got to understand the fuller picture of the energy regulation, and why a certain methodology is implemented in electricity and not in petroleum pipelines. Because yes,
Yeah.
they are both network industries, but they work differently, and the type of businesses that operate in these industries are different. We spoke about electricity. You've got ESCOM. If you look at petroleum pipelines, you've got a multitude of companies, and example, how do you lessen the entry barriers in petroleum pipelines, where it's a very vibrant, active, quick, kind, fast moving, if you say, kind of a market. as opposed to electricity. Oh, well, we're still dealing with this giant. So, at the municipal level for electricity, for example, you are in Joburg, I'm in Pretoria. I can't buy electricity from City Power. I have to buy it from City of Tshwane. So those kinds of intricacies, once you start to understand them, then you start to understand why different kind of regulatory methodologies, and you start to understand then the response from the regulated entities. So for me, those kinds of lessons, the dynamic nature of the area, being able to adapt from one area to another, and be able, to decipher if the providers or of these services, are they making profits or not, because you still also have to go to, from a regulatory perspective, to promote investment. Regulation doesn't exist in a vacuum where it's only laws and the companies or the regulated entities must respond. As I said, there's the social, there's the economic dynamic to it that
Yeah.
then looks at the economy as a whole.
No, for sure. So adaptability, a willingness to keep on learning, and business acumen, essentially, to understand how it all comes together. And particularly, I'm passionate about like the learning aspect of things, because I think it's a myth that I can't get into a particular field because I don't know about the nuts and bolts in it. There are some skills that are applicable across the board. Once you sort of understand methodologies and that type of thing, you can learn the rest, as long as you're willing, like you said, to your point earlier on, if you're willing to adapt to a situation and engage in that uncomfortable period where you're in the place where you're asking questions a lot, you're not quite sure, eventually you'll get through that learning curve and start to truly understand the industry that you're in, the nuances of that industry. So, but you have to be willing to learn, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there. Before I jump to another question, there's one in the comments that I just want from Tools123. How do you think the regulator can address social and environmental trade-off from energy projects? Is it being addressed? Is it being addressed enough from your opinion? That's a question in the comments. Did you get that, or you want me to?
Yeah, I got it, Kutai.
Okay.
I think my response will be structured in this way. We firstly need to understand, um, you know, the regulator for energy, which is NERSA, has got a certain mandate, and now you've got environmental, which is the mandate of, change its name every time, this department is called now, I think, Department of Environmental, Forestry and Fisheries, something like that,
Yeah.
DEFF. So now, I think by way of example, let's use the renewable energy, sector in South Africa. In terms of the program for renewable energy, there are rules. These rules are embedded in the request for proposal that the IPP office of the energy department, you know, publishes. And the respondents then are required to meet certain aspects that relate either to economic or socio-economic development. So those are dealt with at that level. And now here's the interaction. So you need a license to operate this energy project, which is the power plant in this case. You know, when you do that application, also the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, when they look at your application for a license, they do assess it. I mean, they do economic and financial, social, environmental, administrative, the financial strength of the entity that is applying. So they look at this, you know, this entire, call them evaluation criterion, in order for them to give you this kind of a license. And then also then part of this application will contain the environmental impact assessment, which is done by DEFF. So, if you've gotten the approval for that, then it would mean that the environmental, concerns have been addressed. I mean, I can make an example of an environmental concern where there's a stream, in the land that you are going to build this power plant. if you get that consent will have conditions that actually says create a pathway to ensure that this stream still exists. And this is at the cost of the applicant. You know, I mean, when we talk, are they doing enough, or you know, is it enough in terms of the amount spent in these socio-economic development kind of projects and enterprise development kind of projects? That is debatable. Somebody might say, maybe compared, if somebody did an analysis compared to the profits that the company is making, the percentage is not enough. Or then, we can look at things in absolute terms to say there's a community, there was no school in this community, there was no, small enterprises were not blooming. Now there is some economic activity that is happening. So is that a positive spin-off? Possibly it could be. So clearly that tools use the word trade-off there, because
Yeah.
really in economics and also in regulation, we deal with these kinds of trade-offs. And as I said, regulation must also be proportionate. These trade-offs also need to reach a level where they are proportionate to each other.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think at no given time are you going to be able to have a 100% win-win situation in everybody's favor for some of these things, right? If the prevailing interest at that time is economic, we want to create employment in this particular area, then maybe some of these other interests are going to not necessarily be going to be winning if as a result. But in certain situations, maybe if those interests are what are prevailing in terms of we need to protect this environmental or heritage site or something of that nature, and it's in the best interest of that community to do so, then those are the ones that will win in that particular interest. So it's really just, and again, over time, those interests might change and develop accordingly. So it's about I think having appreciation and line of sight as to what are the prevailing interests at any given moment of time, and if those interests change, how then can they be readdressed to make sure that the balance is reflective of the current situation and what needs to be protected. So thanks for the question. I hope it's been answered. Feel free to pop a message into the chat to let us know, and anyone else who has a question, you can do so as well. So we've touched on a lot of things today, and I think you've definitely given people an appreciation of, the career path and, the different aspects of it and, how it can be applied in different industries. So if someone, myself, John, Susan, Peter, whoever it might be, is very inspired and wants to explore further this career path. What sort of advice would you give them in terms of pursuing it, either getting their toes wet or jumping straight in and being like, what, I found my calling. I'm convinced to me that this is the way to go. What advice would you give them?
Okay. Again, jokingly, you don't have to be a person to pursue a career in regulatory affairs or compliance, risk management. So, but, what I would say first and foremost is start with the fundamentals. I think, be grounded, especially in the theoretical aspects of the industry in which you want to pursue such a career in regulatory affairs. I mean, we spoke of pharmaceuticals. I've seen that most of the jobs in regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical industry, they still emphasize that you need a background or you need some form of formal qualification in pharmacy. However, this might not be the case in other industries. As we've seen, I worked in telecoms. I was not an IT or an engineer. Now in electricity, I'm not an electrical engineering. So, but make sure that you understand and you can grasp the background knowledge of this industry of this sector that you want to get into, because really, some of these regulatory affairs or compliance positions are sort of pegged from middle management going up. So now you need to be ready to be a fast learner of the aspects of the business, not the aspects of regulation, because those it's taken that you are bringing that
You're coming with those to the table at the very least.
you know, so be grounded in that. I think if I had to go into pharmaceuticals, I will need to understand how a pharmaceutical business work, how is a drug come into being, how are trials conducted, so that by the time I'm in that position, I'm able to apply then the standards, the regulations into that job. Again, as you know, as a step two of this, be ready to learn. Be open minded. And for me, I found this to be very, and it's exciting. One thing that I did when I joined the company Enel that I work with, I identified one or two people, to whom when I start reading technical documents, I go and ask them to say, look, can you tell me this thing in English before we
Not
terms?
legal, not legalese in
Not
English.
Chinese, not whatever, but in English. What I find in that is that it allows you then to put things in to understand stuff in a practical manner, and then you'll be able to respond to whatever is in front of you from a technical point of view. you know and I mean, another thing that I normally employ, and you know the internet is a space where you can find anything and everything. you know and I mean, I'm doing a course now, with Vets Business School. It's called the Master of Management in Energy Leadership. Now, I've finished the coursework, but you can imagine there was a course called Energy Value Chains, and they were teaching us how an electrical turbine in a nuclear facility works. Now, most of us who are sitting there are not electrical engineers or physicists. So to get to understand that, I used to just you get into the internet and you type
Yeah.
something such as nuclear fission, and you get the most basic understanding of it. So this is the kind of activity that you'll want to get in as a if you want to pursue a career in regulatory affairs, because you are going to be encountered with technical aspects of the business which you must then step up to. And as I said, you need to think practically. you know you need to be a thinker, but you need to be a thinker that puts things into practice. Businesses don't have time for us to theorize and code and code
You
whomever.
can't be out there. Section XYZ says you must do this and walk away and you're done with the conversation.
You can't do that. You need to put things practically, whether they're coming from a legislation, which is the principal legislation, which mainly tells you what to do, or whether it comes from a technical standard, which tells you how to do stuff. You need to think about that practically. And as I said, you are involved now in the strategic nature of this task. You need then to start thinking about what it does it mean for the bottom line of the company, obviously within the bounds of what is required, because
Yes,
want to, you don't want to
absolutely. We must highlight that for sure.
chase the bottom line and forget about those. But again, this last one is, you know, either unfortunate or fortunately, but you have to understand both sides of the coin. We mentioned earlier that if you are in a regulated entity, you need to know regulations. You need to understand the point of view of the regulator so that you can know or understand how the regulation is applied, and then you can have a strategy or approach that will assist your company in that area. But lastly, again, I would say be ready to read, be ready to write, be ready to type, and be ready to talk a lot, as we've seen. That
As you
kind
can
of
see, both of us are skilled in that area, so we are fine.
So
Talking is
that is the last, kind of
yeah,
advice I would give, because you are going to have a plethora of documents to read. We are going to have to respond to regulatory or compliance consultations. You are going to engage with industry, your peers in other, either in the same industry or in other industries. You are going to have to learn methodologies, why certain countries do it this way and why can't we do it in that way in South Africa. And this requires then the person who will be able not to get bored, especially by reading all of these
yeah.
kinds of.
And you need to be able to present your organization's perspective, like you're saying. So if you're coming representing, trying to influence policy, you need to be able to articulate that and communicate that to the regulators and industry forums. So we joke about being able to talk, but if you can't present your ideas and views on policy matters, then it's something that you're going to have to work on. But I just also want to touch on a point that you raised around learning and the course that you've done and how you also went to YouTube. This is kind of something that I highlight a lot, and every opportunity I get, I mention it, that learning does not only mean go and get a certificate. So if you want to be in a particular industry, it doesn't mean now you must go and become an electrical engineer. Or okay, I'm interested in pharmacy, now I must go and get a pharmacy degree. It's a multifaceted approach. Go to Google. There's so many things I have learned and applied just from Google, or something. If I didn't understand a concept, I Googled it and I found, beginner's guide 101 explanation of, I don't know, cryptocurrency or something like that. And that's how I started, the educational journey to learn about something. So I'm always encouraging people that, don't be linear in your approach when we're talking about learning, continuous learning, and that, it can be a conversation like we're having. I've learned so much already about industries I've never worked in. Obviously, it's a drop in the ocean, but I know a little bit more than I knew yesterday about the energy sector. So, it's about also plugging into your different networks and not being afraid to ask questions if you are in a new industry as well, and be like, can you sit down with me and take me through what this means? So there's so many ways to learn. And I truly encourage people, whether it's regulatory affairs or any other career path, continue to learn, but be multifaceted in your approach. It's not about throwing thousands of rands at courses and just spending months and months and months on something. Sometimes you just need to get an understanding of the fundamentals. So just think about that when you're choosing to learn about different industries or disciplines as going forward. And that was just something I needed to get out there.
Great, great.
Awesome. Well, unless anyone, I'm looking at the chat and I don't see any additional questions. And Tools 1 to 3 has says, yes, we answered his question. So that's great. Perfect. I do always end the compliance conversation by saying it's important to be respectful of people's time. And you have graciously given us your hour to educate us, inform us, and put us in a much better position when it comes to understanding regulatory affairs. So I'd like to thank you so much for that and for joining compliance conversations today. To me, it was very, very enlightening. I can't wait to share the link with those who weren't necessarily able to join us for this live hour, so that they can also benefit from all the experience that you've had. But I don't know if you've got any last words you'd like to share with them before we go.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity. And I must say, the hour just went by like that. Absolutely.
It did. Time flies when you're having fun, they say.
Oh, of course. But what I would like to say lastly, I mean, we've been speaking about regulatory affairs, but as we said, these kinds of careers are referred to by different names depending on the industry or depending on the company. I mean, sometimes you hear institutional affairs, you hear government liaison, but when you go, to the meat of what is required here, is this dynamic, adaptable person, and, a person who has these interpersonal skills, whether at the lower level with colleagues, but also with the outside world, which is the world of regulatory authorities, the world of industry colleagues. So, and I must say it's very exciting for the mere fact that you get your, you get to touch so many areas, sometimes even when, it's not required, but the experience that you accumulate actually bears value at the end.
Absolutely, and what a great way to round off, what it is that you do, and the impact that you can have in the regulatory affairs space. So thank you again for being for joining me for this conversation, and I hope that you can join us again at some point and share different perspectives again on whatever it is that you might be doing in the future. I know we'll certainly stay in touch. I've got lots of things I want to pick your brain on. But yes, and thank you to everybody else who joined the conversation today. I appreciate your time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're always going to have other exciting people on the show discussing lots of different career paths and aspects of compliance and regulatory affairs and everything to do with anything around that. So thanks for joining, everybody, and I look forward to having you on Compliance Conversations for the next session. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.